Hello, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Because I thought it was a bit difficult to hear from the back when I was listening. It works? Yeah, okay. Very good. Thank you so much for inviting me today. It's really an honor to be here. As you heard, I work with a group called the Agricultural Risk Management Team at the World Bank. And today I'm going to talk about how to formulate an agricultural risk management framework to respond to increasing volatilities according to our experience at the World Bank. I got it. Okay, so I have some people here. We have at the World Bank a dedicated agricultural risk management team at our agricultural global practice, and that's where I work. We're about 5 people who work on agricultural risk assessments. A lot of us work on these systemic risks for the agricultural sector through sector-wide risk assessments. And this is what I will talk about more today. But we also work with commodity-specific risks through supply chain risk management. And we also work to kind of enhance global knowledge via training, capacity building. And we also have a web platform called the FarmD, where we do webinars and we kind of gather the global community on risk management, agricultural risk management. And the World Bank finances agricultural risk management work throughout the world. One thing that I wanted to say a few points before I start talking about this, about why we opt to work with an agricultural risk management framework to manage volatilities. Why we don't just work at risk-specific levels. So first of all, our clients are governments, right? Our clients are countries. And for them, volatilities implies risks for the countries and the stakeholders in that they create uncertainties in the environment that the sector operates in. Another thing that we talked a little bit about in the previous presentation is that price volatilities are often symptoms. They're not causes. So it's important to understand why they come about. Then also risks are complex and multi-layered and are therefore more effectively addressed from a systemic approach or a systems approach. And then also that countries must manage volatilities from their own specific context. And I actually thought it was a very good kind of continuation of the previous presentation because it gave more kind of a context in the world and where the world is heading. And now I will talk a lot more about what we do at country levels with the countries that we work with. So here you can see that it's kind of cross-cutting agricultural risks across sectors, and it touches upon different aspects of the country's economies. Okay, so the sector-wide risk assessments is something that the World Bank developed a few years ago, so we used to work a lot more at just commodity level and look at supply chain risks, but we noted that it was more effectively to kind of look at the broader level of the risks. We've done this across the world in many different countries. Me personally, I've been working in Central Asia, in Mongolia, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I will give you several examples from this. What we try to do is that we try to support the implementation of the country's general agricultural strategies so that the growth objectives in these strategies are being kept. So we're not trying to do self-standing agenda in the countries. And what it does for the countries is that it allows the countries to better target often limited resources and to minimize losses from risks. I wanted to also, before I get into the presentation, I wanted to define risks, or how we define risks, tell you. So for us, risks are uncertain events that leads to losses. I know that sometimes when we talk about risks like general, yeah, like this? Okay. So when we talk, I sometimes hear people talk about risks in the context of risks and opportunities, that, you get into a risky situation and it may be that it provides you great opportunities. This isn't how we define it when in this context. We talk about uncertain events that lead to losses. And so, for example, I mean, the volatilities, that's what it is essentially. These are the symptoms of risks, but the causes might be droughts, or it might be floods, or it might be input price spikes, and so on. And risks, as we work with it, it differs from constraints, because constraints is a context in which you operate in that leads to the suboptimal performance. But it's still, you can predict it. So your symptoms might be low yield levels, or it might be low profit margins, and so on. But really, the important part of it is that they are predictable. And so, one example, for example, could be when you look at export bans. If they are a risk or if they are a constraint, a permanent export ban is a constraint because the market can kind of adapt to it, or like the producers can adapt to it. However, a government who imposes and lifts export bans on on an erratical basis, so you don't, it's not rule based. That would be a risk for the actors in the sector. Risks for us also differs from trends. So trends are also like longer term changes in your environment, in the environment in which you operate, but you can still predict them. So again, I would say that, I think also the previous presenter talked about this in terms of climate change. So for us, like increasing temperatures per se is not a risk. It's a trend because we know about it. However, these extreme weather events that we can't really predict, that would be a risk for us. Makes sense. So when we do these agricultural sector-wide risk assessments, this is our process flow. So first we get the demand from the client. We always call them the clients. This is essentially the governments that we work with. So we get a request from a government, and then we go into what we call the risk assessments. That's when we try to map the existing risks in the countries. We try to quantify them, and we try to prioritize them according to which are the most important risks in a country, and so on. We do a desk review, but then we also go obviously into the countries. When we work, I know that a lot of you might not be so familiar with how we work at the World Bank, but we always work in collaboration with governments. We don't do things and just go in. We would work in collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture. In the context, normally the Minister of Agriculture would say. So we go in and we do this in-country assessments. Also, we talk to the main stakeholders, and towards the end of our visit there, we organize big workshops to present our findings and to discuss with the stakeholders in the sector. It would be private sector participants for sure, a lot of public sector, also just interest organizations like the farmers' representative organizations and so on. And see, I think someone also mentioned this today about the importance of kind of have this dialogue with the actors in the sector. And then we have, of course, come up with ideas of what we think the appropriate risk management instruments should be for this. But we want to know how well would these work in the country context also. And this is something that you have to be in the country to know. So we normally take kind of a filtering approach. We present maybe 20, 30 different solutions options, and we ask the stakeholders if they can rank them, if they think it would be sustainable, would it be implementable given the context that they work in, would it be profitable, would they have money for it, and so on. So different levels. Then when we have, when they have singled out these most interesting kind of solutions areas, as we call it, that would be like the kind of systems approaches to risk management. We also, of course, we agree on this with the clients, with the governments, and we come back and we do what we call a solutions assessments. Again, this is involving both desk research and I will get into this a lot more later, but also in-country consultations. And then after this is done, we really hand over the leadership to the governments in the countries. However, we often provide technical support in this, in them developing a risk management agenda or just incorporating this directly into the general agricultural strategies and so on. And then it's the implementation and monitoring and evaluation, which are crucial Because a lot of times, you think that as long as you have the answers, this will just be automatic, but it's not really how it happens. Okay. So, okay, so from the point of view of our clients, when they approach us, they normally have some concerns. And often this concern is food security in terms of prices and or availability. It really depends on the country. But this is such a, politically, as you all know from past events over the past years, it can trigger a lot of things in a country. So it is a big concern for the governments. They often have, or some of the countries, many countries have limited physical space to manage kind of coping mechanisms like humanitarian response or social safety programs and so on. And then again, like the domestic political economy, it matters because you often have a lot of risks in countries, but among constituencies that are not that important. However, for governments, it kind of triggers their attention when these risks have large impacts on their constituency. And so it can be, rural versus urban, or farmers versus processors or traders. However, there are a lot of other areas that are affected that are, the governments don't always connect directly with the risk and risk management. So obviously, household income and poverty. We noticed that, as you will see for one of the countries that I will talk about, risks tend to enforce poverty traps, for example, among very poor populations. Malnutrition, for sure. Sustainability and economic growth also, as we will see. And then what we also can see is that, the government's fiscal balance in terms of like lost taxes and then also the foreign exchange receipts and so on. So this is agricultural GDP growth in Malawi from the late 60s to the early 2010, yeah. And so we start, when we look at why this is important to an economy, we start by looking at how do risks kind of affect growth in the country. And what you can see, like, first of all, we can see directly that you have a lot of negative growth in the agricultural sector. I know because I have read Malawi's obviously agriculture strategies, economic development strategies, and so they have a growth objective that they have committed to under the CADA process of 6% annually. And when you see a figure like this, where you have 6 dips in the past 30 years, but you also have 5 dips only since the early 1990s. You know that this is a problem for their growth objectives, first of all. So Malawi is still an agricultural-based economy. About 80% of the population live in rural areas, working primarily in agriculture. 30% of their GDP is agriculture, and I think around 70% of exports comes from agricultural commodities. So this will affect their economy as a whole. And here comes the next figure then, where you can see how it affects the economy. So what I've done here is I put the agricultural GDP growth on top of the regular GDP growth, and you can see directly that this have direct impacts on the economy as a whole for Malawi. We also, when we look at it, we look at, okay, what happened in these big dips, and it's a lot of droughts going on there. However, this is not how the picture is going to be for all countries that we work with. So we'll now transfer to Mongolia. And so Mongolia, first maybe I should explain the bars here. So the red bars are agricultural GDP growth per year, and the blue bars are general GDP growth per year. I don't know how much you know about Mongolia, but it was a centrally planned economy until the early 1990s, but lately they have a big mining industry in the country. So this the economy has diversified a lot, especially since the mid-late 1990s. And what you can see is that, yes, during this period of transition, after around decollectivization and so on, you see that ag and regular GDP growth, they follow kind of hand in hand in the, in 1990s, but then after that they completely go in different directions. So like the agricultural risks for Mongolia will not affect the economy as a whole in the same way as they did for Malawi. However, it's important still for Mongolia because about a third of their population are still involved in agriculture. They have a huge nomadic herding sector, so herds, livestock sector. And also poverty is highest in rural areas. This is common all around the world. But so when you have these dips in agriculture, which you certainly have here, I mean, you have 10 negative growth, agriculture goes into negative growth 10 times in the past 30 years. It's going to have big impacts on your poor population and on, I mean, everyone who lives in the rural areas and are involved in agriculture then. So that's important. Okay, so now I'll talk a bit more about how we do these sector-wide agricultural risk assessments. So we look at risks at 3 levels of the sector. Production risks, so essentially droughts, pests and diseases, and so on, or climatic risks, I would say. Then market risks, price volatilities, one example, and also enabling environment risks, which is essentially erratic policy changes, going back again, not poor policies per se, but these rapid changes that are very difficult to predict in the sector. In order to capture the whole sector, we take a bulk of the commodities for the sector, most of the time around like 80%. So the biggest commodities that jointly make up for 80% of the gross agricultural output are the ones that we kind of capture in this, and then we assess this through like qualitatively and quantitatively. Okay, so how do we do this? So this is an example from Malawi, potato, I think it is. So we pull out as much yield data as we can for these commodities that we have identified as the biggest commodities. And then we look at the line over the past, in this case, 30 years, because we had data for that long. In some cases where you have like big structural shifts, it might be useful to do also like shorter trend lines, but we try to do as long as possible. And then we look at the trend line, so that would be the blue line. And then we identify like 1/3 of the standard deviation line, and then we look at what happened in those years where you have dips that are kind of lower or bigger, I know how to say, from this below this 3%, a third of the standard deviation. Sorry, not 3%, a third. And then we estimate like how much are these dips worth, basically. What happened in those years and how much are they worth? And why do we put in this third of the standard deviation? Well, it's because in agriculture it's always going to be ups and downs. We say that like smaller changes are essentially like the regular cost of doing business for any producer in the agricultural sector. But anything below that, it shouldn't have to happen. Or if it happens, this is a major risk for the sector. Okay, so we try to cost them. We also look at how many times do they happen, and then we get this, basically. We look at what is the frequency of the losses for the different crops, and what are the size of the losses. And this is for the entire period. What this does is that it enables us to kind of identify what crops do you have the biggest losses from risks. So if you are a government and you have limited resources, it kind of allows you to look at, where do you kind of target your resources? Where would you target your policies? It's a way of kind of prioritizing within the sector what to look at. And so I put in these small red lines. This one is from Rwanda. I am working in Rwanda, but if I would advise the government, if they felt like they don't want to capture everything, I would put in these red lines. Maybe I would say that, okay, cassava and plantains have the biggest losses. That might be where you want to start. Or, sweet potato and maize because they have the most frequent losses. But you also see that the Irish potato has really big losses. I'd like you to keep an eye on the maize losses because they're not so big, but they're fairly frequent, and I will get back to that in a bit. We also look at what happened in those years, right, where you had these big losses. And so this is, again, Mongolia. And we try to just look at why are there losses and where are the biggest losses. And so the biggest losses for livestock are zoods. I don't know if you know what a zood is. A zood is an extreme climatic event. It's normally a drought in the summer followed by a very extreme winter that has huge impacts on the livestock sector in terms of mortality of livestock there. So that has by far the biggest impacts on the livestock sector, but drought is has big impacts on the on crop production. You can see that, they're very different in terms of size, these two bubbles, because the livestock sector is much bigger than the crop sector also. So proportionally, that might not be the case, in terms of the impacts on the risks of the sector. But then you could also see that transition had a big impact on the sector as a whole, which was a one-time event. But for other countries, this might be domestic conflicts that was also mentioned in the previous presentation that will have these. And these might be recurring, and they have big impacts on the sector. So. Then we try to do this at a subnational level, the regional level. This is again for Rwanda. This is our average annual losses over the past 20 years in the different regions. And you can see where the main risks are in terms of losses. You can also look at, you look at the proportion of the product that is produced in this region, and then what is the proportion of that is the loss that occurs in this region. And then you can also identify risks by doing this that aren't visible at an aggregate level, because a lot of times they kind of disappear. And again, it helps targeting policies and limited resources. So I don't know if you remember the other figure. You had cassava was the biggest the biggest crop in terms of losses, in terms of the value of the losses. So if you would do some kind of risk management for cassava, you might want to focus in Rwanda in the western and southern and eastern regions, because that's where you have losses. But it may also be that if you, for example, if there is a small share of the production that is in one region that doesn't have proportionally very big losses, but as a proportion of their actual production, it's big. You might want to work with that also. Maybe even moving out of the actual producing that crop. When it comes to price risk, it's a lot more difficult to assess the kind of impacts on quantitatively, because who bears the costs of increases versus decreases? Output price volatilities can be offset or even caused by changing input prices. Producer prices and retail prices and international prices don't always change equally, which may decrease the impacts on the economy as a whole or even provide opportunities for certain actors. There are additional layers on complexities because even self-sufficient farmers they tend to sell a bit early on in the season, right after harvest, but then have to buy back food later on in the season. And then also decreased commodity prices will, of course, like all other things equal, be beneficial to consumers. So it depends on if you have like a net producing, net consuming economy, etc. But it's important still to understand volatilities in order to understand the uncertainties in the sector and what are the causes of these volatilities. And so this is one of my favorite figures. It's actually not food, it's tobacco production and prices in Malawi. And tobacco is their biggest export crop. It's something that they're trying to kind of diversify from for obvious reasons. But this figure, what it shows, I put the price. Let me see. The price line lags 1 year, I would say. Basically, it's 1 year late. the prices are going up and down a lot in this sector. But when you move, what happens basically is that when they have a good year, the prices go down, and then everyone stops producing tobacco for the next year. So because they kind of diversify, they go into another crop, then prices go up, of course, and then they get back into tobacco. So when you move the price line 1 year forward, you have like an exact correlation between production and the prices, more or less. So other marketing and enabling environment risks are SPS and food safety related unpredictable trade restrictions, volatile exchange rates, erratic export and import regulations, erratic sector policies, for example, subsidies or market interventions, and so on. And all of these are disincentives to production and ultimately contribute to market volatilities. So when we do this also, I mean, we have our model, but we do a lot of like just also assessing, trying to assess qualitatively, like where are the risks and who is affected and so on. We also don't stare blindly at the trend line that we have decided, or like the years that we first looked at. Sometimes you have a very stable environment, maybe for 25 years, and the last 5 years become much more volatile, and this was indeed the case in Malawi. So when we look at price data for maize, for example, the coefficient of variation coefficient is not very, it's not so high. But when you look at just the last couple of years, basically the last 5 years, you see a lot more volatilities in prices, which we know that this has to do with government kind of interventions in the sector. Obviously, we do look at future risks when we discuss this. We don't model for the future risks, but we do discuss it from the point of view of existing climate change projections. But again, it's important to talk about risks versus trends. And then we also look at potential future risks given existing policies and the strategic vision for the sector. So we look at, again, the strategic documents and existing policies and so on. Going back then to the maize example, I wanted to just give an example from Rwanda. And Rwanda has a very solid agricultural policies in many aspects, and they're trying to create structural changes in the sector through kind of incentivized support and so on. One of these things that they're trying to do is to get farmers to consolidate their land and focus on one crop, to produce together or in some kind of cooperative setting. Maize is one of their strategic crops. However, so today, the way the sector looks is very diversified. Farmers normally grow several different crops at the same time. Sometimes when it comes to certain crops, they even produce different varieties. Beans would be one such example, that they might even have like 3 different bean varieties at the farm level. However, of course, what we remember from the figure was that maize had very frequent risks, even though it wasn't very big in the economy as a whole. But as this takes place and you do consolidate land and move more into monocropping for productivity reasons and economic growth reasons, these risks are likely to have a bigger impact on the economy also. So it's important to take that into account and to think about how can you then mitigate for these risks. Same also, they are trying to more streamline supply chains and make more integrated, and also to encourage processing. Which means that farmers we know this from everywhere in the world, farmers will have to stick to one variety and deliver one variety and so on. And this is going to change the structure in which they operate and maybe be more conducive to risks. So then you should think about, as a government, like, okay, how do we mitigate for this, or what kind of risk management tools are available for us? Okay, so after we have looked at assessed the risks at a national and regional level, and we assessed the losses, and what are the crops and what are the perils that we prioritized, the next steps are to, first of all, identify the root causes of these risks. Are they, internal or external, and so on. Why are the yield losses? Is it droughts, or is it pests and diseases? Is it disease outbreaks, and so on? But then we also make a stakeholder assessment. So we look at what are the stakeholders in the supply chain and who is mostly impacted by these losses, both in absolute terms and in relative terms. We also look at different income groups among producers. I'd have to say that normally better off farmers are a lot more resilient to these risks than poor farmers, and have kind of natural cushions to manage risks. And then also gender roles in the sector do they have different traditional gender roles? And what does this mean for who bears costs of risks, and also for future policies and risk management tools? We also map what is already ongoing in the sector, in the country, because no country is not doing anything about risks. I mean, there's always things ongoing already. So we try to see how much is it and where is it and so on. And now we're ready to identify the risk management instruments. And what we have developed is kind of a layering approach to how you choose your risk management instruments. So for risks that have a fairly high probability but are not particularly severe in terms of their impacts, in terms of losses, we say that mitigation can probably minimize these risks fairly well by itself. Mitigation would be irrigation, drought-tolerant seeds. Sometimes it's just knowledge, agricultural practices, and so on. Whereas where you have risks that are a little less probable, but they are more severe, you might want to opt for a transfer mechanism where you transfer the risk, the cost of the risk, to a third party. So that would be insurance or price hedging systems, for example. And then there will always be risks in every country, as we all know. It's not just for low and middle income countries. Risks that are too big for the private sector to bear themselves. So there will be also need for coping mechanisms, what we call coping mechanisms, which is food aid, humanitarian responses, social safety nets, and so on. Okay. Okay, so why is effective risk management important for our clients? Well, production losses imply lost investment in the sector, both private and public investments. So even if you have an insurance, for example, you have lost your asset already when it comes to that. And for a government who has support to the agricultural sector, that means that they put in money into something that is a loss also. Often for governments, the cost of the coping mechanism, especially for the low-income countries, it's a very heavy burden on their budgets, and it means diverting resources from more long-term objectives. So if you as a country has an annual expense of about $50 to $100 million in food aid, it means that it's not going to go into your schools, it's not going to go into rural roads, it's not going to go into other infrastructure and so on. And there is also often very big wins from investing in mitigation measures, not only because you minimize the losses, but also because a lot of times the reason why there are such big losses is because you don't have particularly modern or good technologies at farm level. So just by trying to mitigate for the losses, you may also have general productivity increases at farm level or even in other places in the supply chain. And then also that the fact that risk management is often conducted ad hoc and through a piecemeal approach, and sometimes through contradictory policy, often through contradictory when it comes to more long-term policies versus these quick policies. And so a systems approach helps streamlining and prioritizing the intervention. Okay, so this is another example from Malawi. This is of how the current costs of risks and risk management looks in Malawi. And I don't want to say that this is it in absolute terms. This is more kind of indicative, because we did have problems with data and data constraints, but also expenditure data. But what you can see is that even though they actually allocate a lot to agriculture, about 10% of the regular budget goes to agriculture, not that much goes into risk mitigation. And at the same time, you have large losses. This is the annual average losses over the past 30 years in Malawi, only at production level, in the field losses, essentially. And then you see over the past 4 years, which actually hasn't been particularly volatile years for Malawi, at least not according to the official data, there is still almost $100 million that goes into food aid. And this doesn't even capture the kind of food price subsidies, because we haven't been able to get proper data for that. So, I mean, what we think is that if you would reallocate part of that coping into more mitigative mechanisms, you may not have to have so many losses. You might have a general productivity increase, and you certainly don't have to come in with $100 million a year in food aid. When it comes to the contradictory policies, I mean, this figure is also from Malawi, but it could be almost any country. But what I'm trying to show is that normally you have these longer-term objectives of productivity increases, and so through your agricultural policies, general agricultural policies, that ultimately try to target the farmers. But a lot of countries, they also have kind of a separate set of food security policies, and that a lot of times are part of them at least are trying to manage prices in the sector. But of course, when you start trying to manage prices in a sector, you probably will create disincentives to the farmers unless you compensate farmers properly. You'll create disincentives, and therefore your agricultural productivity policies will not be as effective. So it's important to streamline your policies. Then it's also important to have a proper monitoring and evaluation system, also because a lot of countries are also missing this. So you have policies, but you don't really get any feedback on how effective the policies are, or the expenditures in this sector. So the choices depend on the type of country that we work with. There is no one set that fits all countries. We conduct, or the World Bank, works with risk assessments in diverse countries, very diverse countries, from Brazil and Kazakhstan to Malawi and Niger. And they have very different challenges and options available depending on the general income levels, of course, also the natural resource environments, available resources, what is the donor presence, what are the donors' interests also when, if you try to do this. Also the other systems in place, like social safety nets, registers, and M&E system, monitoring and evaluation systems, is important. I mean, because if you have a kind of a digitalized economy, which you do in many of these countries, you can talk about having cash transfers, for example. But if you don't have that, and you don't even have a register over who is the population, who are the poorest in the country, and so on, who is mostly affected, it's very difficult. You have to really alter the available mechanisms. Also, is it a rural versus urban economy, net consumers versus net producers? And then is it well integrated in the world market, or is it mostly depending on regional markets and so on? And then the political economy and the windows of opportunities is really important. It's going to determine what you are able to do in the end. You have to be very patient when you work in practice in this. There are so many very obvious response mechanisms, and I think Chris is very well aware of this. But when you come into the country and you talk about what would be ideal for the sector, this might not always be possible, because every government depends on certain kind of pillars in the society. And there's also, in these suboptimal systems, you often have a lot of there are always groups that are kind of profiting from this, so it's important to take into account. So what are some of the challenges for us? Well, when we're doing this, I would say data. The inaccurate data, sometimes the data is even debated within the country. So we come and we have used the country sets, and still you go into the policymakers and they say, I don't know if the losses are really that big, because actually, we're not really sure about that particular crop. We think that maybe the data is not accurate. So that's problematic. Even expenditures can be problematic, like who is present in terms of like risk management, getting a full picture of that. And then especially at subnational level. And I think this is okay when you work in small countries, but when you work in big countries, it's really important to have subnational level data and maybe agricultural ecological zone data also for this. Again, it's difficult to measure the price volatility impacts on the economy as a whole or for the agricultural sector, because whose losses are we measuring? There are winners and losers in this. So you have to decide then with the government, like what stakeholders are we interested in understanding the risk for? Then you can start looking at it properly. And then the climate change projections. Again, unfortunately it's beyond our scope. We're not doing this. So we're basing all our discussions on already existing research and surveys. And they're often not, for a lot of countries that I work in, it's getting better, but they're still not conducted at like subnational or AZ levels. And it makes it difficult to kind of integrate it with our findings at these regional levels, because you would like to be as well targeted as possible, right? And especially when you have limited resources in the countries. And then implementation. So in-country systems again, and the resources is a big challenge. And then the political economy in the country. And that's it. Here are some of the farmers that I talked to recently.